Keisha Monroe let out a sigh of relief as she slid into her window seat in row 14 of the crowded Airbus A320. She had chosen it deliberately, paying extra for the comfort of the view and the peace it offered. The window was her escape, a small refuge from the usual chaos of air travel. With a long flight ahead, she had come prepared, a newfangled noise-canceling headset and a simple expectation of being alone. The cabin buzzed with the last-minute shuffle of passengers boarding. Overhead bins slammed shut, flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, and pre-flight announcements echoed over the intercom. Keisha had buckled her seatbelt and was flipping through the first few pages of her book. The chatter around her faded into a faint background noise. She barely noticed the father and child walking down the aisle until they stopped right next to her. A deep voice broke through her concentration. "Excuse me, I need you to move." Keisha blinked and looked up. The man was taller than her, middle-aged, well-dressed, and clearly impatient. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his expensive watch glinted under the fluorescent lights. The way he stood, the way he spoke, all exuded entitlement, as if he was used to getting what he wanted without having to ask. Beside him was a small girl, no more than 6, clutching a stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her eyes were anxious, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater, avoiding Keisha's gaze. Keisha hesitated. "Excuse me." The man sighed, as if explaining something obvious. He gestured to the empty aisle seat next to her. "My daughter needs a window seat." Keisha looked at the seat next to her, still empty. If it was a matter of seating the girl, why didn't he switch seats with her? The thought made her wary. "I paid extra for this seat," she replied, her tone calm but firm. The man raised his eyebrows, looking annoyed. "Can't you be a little more flexible? She's just a child." Keisha looked down at the girl. Her eyes were shy, a little confused, as if she herself wasn't sure what was going on. This wasn't her wish, but her father's. "She doesn't seem to mind sitting next to you," Keisha said, her voice growing colder. The man frowned, his eyes flashing with annoyance. A few nearby passengers began to notice the situation. "You're being selfish," he said. "A grown woman like you, refusing to give up her seat for a child." Keisha tightened her grip on the book in her hands. Discomfort rose in her, but before she could reply, another voice cut in. "Is there a problem here?" A flight attendant appeared, her eyes sweeping between the two of them. "She's not cooperating," the man said immediately, his voice filled with indignation. "She's refusing to give up her seat for my daughter." The flight attendant turned to Keisha, but before she could say anything, Keisha spoke up. "I paid for this seat. I don't think I should have to give it up." The flight attendant nodded, then turned back to the man. "Sir, if you'd like to change seats with your daughter, perhaps you could have her sit by the window and you sit in the aisle seat." The man's face hardened. "I don't want that. I want her to give up her seat." The flight attendant smiled slightly, but there was something hard in her voice. "Sir, this passenger has the right to keep his seat. If you are not satisfied, we can help find another seat for you." The people around started whispering. A few eyes looked at the man with displeasure. Keisha could see his ears red with anger and embarrassment. He tightened his grip on his bag, glancing around as if looking for support. But no one was on his side. The little girl still held her rabbit tightly, her eyes downcast. Finally, the man pouted, snorted, and pulled his daughter to the other row the flight attendant had just pointed out. Keisha watched, partly relieved, partly feeling sorry for the little girl. She put on her headphones, looking out the window. The deep blue sky stretched out before her eyes. This time, she truly enjoyed the piece she had paid for. Keisha's eyebrows rose as she looked at the man in front of her. She felt her heart rate increase, a familiar feeling of anxiety rising in her chest. She hated arguing on planes. The tight spaces, the prying eyes, and most of all the helplessness of flying made her even more nervous. She shifted her gaze between the man and the child. Her stomach clenched. She hated confrontation, but she also hated being bossed around. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her voice even but firm. "I paid for this seat." For a brief moment, she caught Richard Aldridge's eye. She remembered his name from the frequent flyer card pinned to his carry-on. He looked genuinely surprised, as if the idea of someone telling him, no, was a completely foreign concept. But then his expression hardened. "She's a child," he repeated, more slowly this time, as if Keisha hadn't understood him the first time. "Surely you do." Keisha pressed her lips together. She understood. She understood that a grown man, who could afford a Rolex and a first-class briefcase, had somehow failed to plan for his daughter's needs. She understood that he had assumed she would indulge him, no questions asked. And she understood that if she had been anyone else, a different age, a different race, his approach might have been different. She swallowed, feeling the tension in her body growing. She had tried to keep calm throughout the flight, tried to ignore the anxiety that had gripped her every time the plane lurched. But now, everything, the scrutiny of those around her, the quiet pressure from Richard, the helplessness of being stuck in the sky, made her feel almost suffocated. "I understand," she said, her voice low but firm. "But I paid for my seat. If it's that important, you should have booked it." Richard's lips curled into a disbelieving, deadpan smile. He shook his head, then raised his voice to make sure everyone around him could hear, a move calculated to portray her as the problem. "This is what's wrong with people these days," he said, his tone judgmental. "Basic decency is lacking." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, some turning their heads, a few glancing at Keisha, their expressions a mix of curiosity and embarrassment. She felt her face heat up. She knew exactly what he was doing, and it made her stomach clench. The feeling of anxiety rose even stronger. She gripped the armrests of her chair, trying to steady herself. But before she could reply, a shadow moved into the aisle beside them. Sandra Wallace held her ground, her sharp eyes darting between Keisha and Richard Aldridge, absorbing the tension between them. She could feel the eyes of the others watching the conversation, waiting to see if it would escalate. She had been through this too many times, passengers demanding, others trying to maintain their sense of justice. But this time, there was something different. Richard clenched his fists, trying to keep his cool. "Do you have children, stewardess?" Sandra frowned. She didn't like personal questions, but kept her voice even. "I don't see how that's relevant to this situation, sir." Richard took a deep breath. "If you did, you'd understand. My daughter is terrified, and all I ask is a little kindness from this girl." He tilted his head toward Keisha, his voice laced with reproach. Keisha felt the blood rush to her face. She had booked this ticket, it wasn't her fault. "I understand your daughter's concerns," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "But that doesn't mean I have to give up my rights." Sandra raised her head, scanning the expressions of everyone. She was used to being in the middle of such arguments, but what surprised her was not Richard's stubbornness, but the person sitting 2 rows away, an older woman with light gray hair, who was watching intently. The woman suddenly stood up and walked toward them. "I'll change seats," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't need a window seat." Everyone froze. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She looked at Keisha, then at Sandra. "I used to be a flight attendant," she continued. "And I know that people like her," she pointed at Sandra, "have had to deal with this a lot." Keisha's eyes widened. She didn't just change seats, she understood the situation better than anyone else. Sandra smiled, a rare smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little warmer. Richard, no longer in a position to argue, nodded reluctantly. His little girl quickly took her new seat, still nervous, but at least the situation had calmed down. As Sandra turned away, Keisha watched her, filled with both gratitude and pride. She had not succumbed to pressure. And more surprisingly, a stranger had stood up for justice in a way no one had expected. Keisha didn't budge. She sat straight, eyes looking straight ahead, holding the book tightly in her hands as if it were the last shield between her and the invisible judgment that hung over the cabin. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, shook his head, and sneered. "You really wouldn't move for a child?" Keisha took a deep breath, keeping her voice calm. "I paid for this seat," she repeated, without hesitation. He laughed briefly, a mocking laugh, and then turned his gaze to the other passengers. "Can you believe it? A grown woman refuses to switch seats with a little girl." A murmur began to spread. Some passengers looked down, unwilling to participate. Others watched, waiting to see where the situation would go. The air in the cabin grew heavy with anticipation. Keisha felt her chest tighten. Not because she regretted her decision, but because she realized Richard wasn't just trying to take the seat, he was trying to make her the villain. And the worst part was, it might be working. All eyes were on her, invisible judgments, invisible pressure to be the bigger person. But why did she always have to be the one to give in? Sandra, the flight attendant, seemed to sense the tension rising. She took a step forward, standing closer to Keisha, a small but supportive gesture. "Sir," her voice was low but firm, "I understand your wishes. But this is an assigned seat. If you want, I can check to see if there are any empty window seats. But I will not ask other passengers to give up their seats. Kindness doesn't always equal concession. Sometimes kindness is understanding that everyone has the right to be respected, whether they are adults or children." Richard sighed, his tense shoulders slumping a little. He muttered something under his breath, then reluctantly turned back to his seat. Keisha didn't sigh, nor did she feel triumphant. She just realized that sometimes kindness isn't about giving in, but about standing her ground. And with Sandra standing beside her, without saying a word, Keisha knew that there were people who understood that too. Keisha didn't understand the first part, but she caught the last word. A typical word. A word that made her freeze. Her stomach dropped, as if an invisible hand were squeezing it. Sandra's entire posture changed in an instant. She stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin, sharp line. Keisha could feel the tension radiating off her like heat from a fire. For a second, the entire row seemed to go silent. Not just Keisha. Not just Sandra. Everyone. As if they had all heard it. As if they were all waiting to see what would happen next. Keisha's pulse pounded in her ears, so hard she could barely hear anything else. But she knew. She had heard the word enough times. Enough to know exactly what it meant. And so did Sandra. The flight attendant squared her shoulders, her gaze locked on Richard. Her calm professionalism was replaced by something else. Something colder. More wary. Like a wild cat clenching its claws, ready to strike. "I would advise you to," Sandra spoke, each word carefully measured. "You need to be very careful what you imply." Her voice was firm, almost steely. The energy in the cabin shifted. Some people lowered their heads, some glanced quickly at Richard. Whispers filtered through the rows, a small ripple spreading. But before anyone could react, another voice spoke, cutting through the tension like a knife through a thread. A voice from the row behind. "I paid for my seat." The voice was even but firm. A man. Keisha turned slightly, catching a glimpse of him. Middle-aged. Dark green hoodie. Wire-rimmed glasses. Sitting in the aisle seat, arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking at Sandra. As if expecting her to put an end to this once and for all. Sandra nodded slightly, acknowledging the support, but her eyes didn't leave Richard. "Sir, I need you to tone it down," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Like he couldn't believe what was happening. His anger was rising, his eyes darting around the people around him, as if searching for allies in the silent crowd. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice thick with resentment. He waved his hand, gesturing around. "Doesn't anyone here think it's wrong for a grown woman to refuse to switch seats with a 6-year-old?" A few passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. No one took his side. But that wasn't good enough for Richard. "This is the problem with society today," he continued, his voice loud enough to carry down the aisle. Keisha clenched her fists on the arms of her chair. She could feel her heart rate quicken. She didn't want to be here. Didn't want to be a part of this. But she couldn't turn away either. Keisha felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Not just because of what Richard said, but because she could feel the invisible pressure building around her. She could see some of the passengers avoiding her gaze, some hesitating as if they were weighing whose side to take. It would be easy for them to agree with Richard, to turn this into a debate about kindness and responsibility. But no one had the right to make her the villain. Keisha took a slow breath, steadying herself. "I'm not selfish," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I paid for this seat, just like everyone else here. If it was so important to you, you should have booked it." The man in the green hoodie nodded slightly, as if satisfied with her answer. But Richard was not. He muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have no shame," his face red with anger. Keisha gripped the book tighter, her fingers tightening on the hardcover. She could feel the pressure of everyone's eyes on her, an unspoken expectation. She knew they wanted her to give in. To just move a little, just a little, to give up her position. A small, simple act that would appease everyone. But why should she? Before she could speak, a woman across the aisle spoke up, her voice echoing through the cabin. "She's right. If you wanted a window seat, you should have booked it." Richard turned his head toward the woman, his irritation shifting. "She's a child," he growled, as if that would disprove any argument. "I shouldn't have to plan around selfish people." Keisha sighed, forcing herself to stay calm. She had seen this tactic before, turning a simple situation into a moral issue, accusing others of being bad people to avoid facing the reality that they had no right to demand anything. But this time something was changing. Many of the passengers began to look at Richard with distaste. Some even whispered to each other, shaking their heads. Richard's confidence was wavering. He could feel it. She could see it in the way he tightened his grip on his backpack, as if trying to hold on to one last bit of control. And before he could recover, Sandra stepped forward. Richard felt his blood boil, but he forced himself to keep his cool. He couldn't let them see him lose his cool. "Not now. I need you to take your assigned seat right now, sir." Sandra's voice was sharp, unwavering. Her words weren't just a command, they were a knife cutting through Richard's arrogance. He hesitated. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Richard had always been in control, the one with the final say. But now, he was losing ground, and he knew it. Still, giving up wasn't in his nature. Without a last-ditch effort, Richard turned back to Keisha. His voice was lower, but full of mockery. "You know, keep your seat," he said, his eyes cold. "I don't want my daughter sitting next to someone like you." The words were stronger than he'd thought. Keisha felt a cold anger rising in her chest, like a tidal wave ready to erupt. But she wasn't the only one affected. Sandra, standing tall, her eyes flashing dangerously. She represented not just the rule, but what was right. "That's it," she said, her voice razor sharp. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Richard blinked, feeling things start to go against him. "What did you say?" Sandra's expression didn't change. "You can move to your assigned seat right now, or we'll have to talk to the captain." The atmosphere changed instantly. A new kind of tension settled in the air, the kind that comes when someone realizes they've pushed things too far. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. For the first time since this had started, he looked genuinely uncertain. But hesitation was not the same as surrender. Richard Aldrich was not the type to bow his head easily. He could feel the shift in the gazes of the people around him, the scrutiny of the crowd. For the first time, he was no longer the center of power, but the one on trial. A moment of heavy silence passed. Richard just stood there, his face twisted between anger and disbelief. He had not expected this pressure. This resistance. This sudden change in the situation. And now Sandra's steady, unwavering voice was shaking his stance. "You want me to go with you?" Richard repeated, his voice quieter now, as if he were testing how much power Sandra really had. Sandra did not blink. "Yes, sir." Keisha saw the shift in real time, the way Richard's mind was calculating, trying to figure out his next move. He knew he was on the verge of making this situation much worse. But men like him didn't like losing. So, instead of stepping aside, he played his last card. "I find this interesting," he said, his voice rising. "That you're on her side." But this time, no one wavered. "I bet if the roles were reversed, we would have a very different conversation." The air in the cabin was stifling, as thick as a sealed room with no way out. Keisha felt her stomach tighten, as if an invisible hand was squeezing it. But she fought back the feeling, she didn't react. She refused to give him what he expected. Sandra, however, was done playing. "Sir, I'm warning you," her voice was cold as ice, sharp as a knife. "If you don't take your seat right now, I will be forced to notify the captain. And if that happens..." She trailed off, leaving a potentially terrible scenario playing out in his mind. "I can't guarantee you'll stay on this flight." The whispers in the cabin increased. The passengers weren't just watching now, they were leaning forward, discussing, whispering. Richard was starting to sense it. The real consequences were looming. He looked toward the cockpit, as if gauging how serious Sandra was. And then, something worse happened. Another voice, firm and authoritative. Another flight attendant, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing the same Navy uniform as Sandra, appeared behind her. His name tag read, Javier. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was polite but authoritative, without raising his voice, shifting the mood. Sandra didn't take her eyes off Richard. "No," she said slowly, "but I was just explaining to this passenger that if he continues to refuse to take his seat, we'll have to escalate the situation." Javier's expression didn't change, but his presence shifted the entire energy of the moment. This was no longer just an argument between a passenger and a flight attendant. This was now official. Keisha watched it all, a silent spectator to this tense drama. She saw Richard's internal struggle. He wanted to fight. Every fiber of his being wanted to fight, to not submit. But now, it was more than pride. It was real danger. Richard took a deep breath, his eyes darting between Sandra and Javier. For the first time, his posture slackened. Not quite surrender. But a sign that he had accepted defeat. He muttered something, his voice so low that no one could hear him, and then said no more. He turned, gripping his daughter's hand, a little too tightly, as if afraid of losing her amid the waves of emotion. Then, with a decisive movement, he stomped down the aisle, striding to his seat. A few passengers breathed a sigh of relief, others just shook their heads, exchanging knowing glances but no words. Silence filled the cabin, as if the cabin had just been through a small storm. Sandra exhaled slowly, calming herself before turning back to look at Keisha. "I'm sorry about that," she said, her voice now softer, less sharp than before. Keisha nodded, her gaze darting forward. "It's not your fault." Sandra hesitated for just a second, then added, "If he bothers you again, let me know immediately." Keisha nodded again, more firmly this time. Sandra and Javier walked away, disappearing toward the front of the plane. For the first time since this had started, Keisha felt her body relax a little. But just as she was about to turn back to her book, a voice from across the aisle caught her attention. "You handled it well," the ponytailed woman said, flashing a small, knowing smile. Keisha let out a sigh, somewhere between a giggle and a sigh. "I guess so." But the woman shook her head, her gaze more serious. "A lot of people would have just moved away to avoid trouble. You didn't." Keisha didn't answer right away, because really, she had thought about it. There had been a moment, a truly undeniable moment, where she had felt the pressure to give in, to just move to make this go away, to make things easier. But she hadn't. And now, it was over. Or so she thought. But Richard Aldridge wasn't done yet. Keisha let out a sigh, adjusting her seat, but the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. Even with Richard's back, even with Sandra making it clear that she had done nothing wrong, there was something about the whole situation that Keisha couldn't shake. A bitter taste lingered on her tongue, like something wasn't quite over. She glanced toward his seat, 4 rows ahead, on the opposite side of the aisle. Richard was rigid in his seat, arms crossed, jaw clenched. His daughter sat silently beside him, her eyes fixed on the floor. A different feeling washed over Keisha, not fear, not anger, but a dull sadness. That girl, no matter what, didn't deserve all of this. Keisha still held her stuffed rabbit tightly, her fingers gripping the soft fabric so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes were cast down silently, but in her chest, her heart was pounding so hard it seemed to want to pierce her ribcage. A glimmer of something flickered in her mind, but it was too fragile for her to grasp. Unfortunately, she didn't want anything in this situation. She had never asked for it. But that didn't matter anymore. She had just been dragged into her father's bathroom. She didn't need anyone's pity. But any sympathy she had for Richard was extinguished the moment he turned his head, his sharp eyes meeting hers. Then he sneered. Richard muttered something, the words unclear enough for her to hear. But Keisha didn't need to hear. She knew that tone. That cold look. She understood the dismissive shake of her head as if she were just a nuisance, a problem that needed to be eliminated. No, she wouldn't let him hurt her. She turned back to the window, her fingers gripping the armrest of her seat. She had refused. But then he did something she hadn't expected. Richard stood up. His movement immediately disturbed the atmosphere in the cabin. Nearby passengers turned, eyes following his every move. A flight attendant who was assisting an elderly couple froze when she realized Richard was walking toward Keisha. "Sir, I need you to remain seated," the flight attendant said, stepping toward him warily. But Richard didn't listen. He didn't care. He walked straight past her, each step pounding down the aisle, a drumbeat pounding in Keisha's chest. She didn't move, didn't react, but she felt her heartbeat quicken, her breathing become heavier. A chill ran down her spine. What the hell was he doing? Richard stopped just in front of her row of seats. His fingers tightened on the seat in front of her, veins bulging. The space between them was only inches, but the space was filled with such a tense, suffocating energy that Keisha felt as if she were being drowned. For just a moment, it was just the two of them in silent battle. Then Richard spoke. "You must be so proud of yourself." Keisha didn't blink. Didn't waver. She didn't give him the right to see her scared. Instead, she raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Richard took a deep breath, as if trying to contain something inside him. His eyes darkened. "You sit here, pretending to be the victim." His voice was low, just loud enough for her to hear. "But we both know what's really going on." Keisha felt her fingers tighten on the armrests of her chair. Cold and stiff. This wasn't about the seat anymore. It was never about that. Not about the seat. Not about the inconvenience. Not about the airline's nonsense. It was about control. About ego. About a man who had never been rejected before, and was falling apart because of it. Keisha opened her mouth to reply, but before she could utter a word, Sandra's voice rang out, sharp as a knife. "Sir, please step out of your seat immediately." Patience was finally running out. Richard didn't move. Keisha could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. She thought he would push it further, make it worse. And he probably would have, if Javier hadn't shown up. But this time, Javier didn't ask. "Sir, if you don't return to your seat immediately, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the plane." A silence fell over the cabin. A heavy, tense, suffocating silence. Keisha could feel the weight of every gaze on Richard. This was no longer just an argument. This was a moment. Richard's face was flushed. For a second, he looked as if he were about to argue, his chest heaving, his lips moving. But then he made his decision. With one last look at Keisha, a look filled with anger, shock, and something else, something weaker, more fragile, he muttered something incoherent, then turned on his heel and strode back to his seat. Javier watched him until he sat down. Sandra exhaled, as if she had released a tight string. "Are you okay?" Keisha realized she had been holding her breath. "I'm okay," she said, though her hands were still tense. Sandra nodded, glancing at Javier. And just as Javier reached for his radio, Richard made his final mistake. He mumbled something. Not loud enough for the entire plane to hear. Not loud enough for the passengers in front of him to notice. But loud enough for Sandra to hear. Loud enough for Javier to hear. Loud enough for Keisha to take a deep breath. Sandra chose to remain silent. But Javier did not. His expression changed instantly. No hesitation, no delay. He lifted the radio to his lips. "Captain, we have a situation." And just like that, Richard Aldridge's flight was over before it had even begun. The tension in the cabin rose to a suffocating level. The passengers stopped whispering. No one needed to know exactly what he had said. All they needed to know was this: he had lost control. Some leaned forward in their seats, others craned their necks, eyes glued to the scene before them. The cramped cabin suddenly felt more claustrophobic than ever. Javier's radio clone crackled, keeping him at the front until he could coordinate with the ground crew. Keisha's heart was pounding. She could feel each beat clearly in her chest, as if it was trying to scream something she couldn't quite put into words. Sandra and Javier moved quickly, walking toward Richard, who was still frozen in his seat, eyes staring straight ahead as if refusing to acknowledge what was happening. "Sir Richard," Javier said, his voice calm but with an unwavering determination. "I need you to pack up and step onto the jet bridge." There was no response. Richard didn't move, showing no sign of acceptance. An eerie silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the hum of the engines and the murmurs of disquiet. Sandra took a deep breath, her gaze patient but piercing. "Sir, please cooperate." Nothing. No response. No movement. Richard remained like a statue, his rigidity turning the moment into an invisible confrontation. The other passengers exchanged uncertain glances, as if wondering how much more tense the situation could get. A little girl sitting next to Richard clutched her stuffed rabbit to her chest. Her eyes moved away from her father, looking to the flight attendant in a silent plea for help. Keisha felt something stir in her chest. Not sympathy, not pity, but exhaustion. It should never have come to this. Just a chair. Just a chair. And yet, somehow, it had turned into an unnecessary battle of wills. Javier leaned forward, his voice still calm, but clearer. "Mr. Aldridge, if you refuse to comply, we will be forced to call security." And that was it. Richard took a deep breath, his hands gripping the armrests, his knuckles white. For a moment, everyone seemed to hold their breath. Then, slowly, painfully, as if each movement were a separate battle, he unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood, but not in a hurry. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiff with humiliation. Javier took a step back, clearing the way. Let's go. Richard took a step forward, then paused. Keisha saw it, a moment of hesitation, as if he were about to turn around, about to say something. But instead of speaking, he just shook his head and walked away. The cabin fell silent as Richard was escorted to the front of the plane. A few people turned to each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, relief, annoyance, even pity. Keisha suddenly realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave her body. Sandra stood there for a second longer, as if to make sure everything was okay. She said softly, "If you need anything, let us know." Keisha nodded her thanks, and the flight attendant returned to her duties. The plane seemed to have found its normal rhythm, but Keisha knew, this moment would be a long time coming. The whispers began as soon as they disappeared. Passengers were whispering to each other. Some were shaking their heads, some were muttering something Keisha couldn't understand. But then a voice from across the aisle spoke up, just as the woman with the ponytail shook her head slightly, muttering something. A man sitting behind her let out a soft chuckle. He had expected this. A few others nodded in agreement. But Keisha didn't react. She just turned her face toward the window, letting the moment sink in. She wasn't proud of what had happened. She wasn't happy. She was just tired. Because she knew that if she had reacted differently, if she had spoken up, if she had done anything other than stand her ground in silence, this story could have ended very, very differently. That was the most painful part. And despite the tension of the confrontation, the humiliation that Richard had tried to inflict on her, Keisha had no regrets. Because in the end, she didn't move. And that was enough. But while Keisha stayed, Javier chose a different path. He stood up as soon as the dust settled, walking across the aisle with a determined look in his eyes. Without hesitation, he walked forward, toward the door at the end of the train car. No one stopped him, but everyone watched. He didn't say anything to Keisha, nor did he turn around. Maybe he knew that she had done the right thing, in her way. And so did he. This story isn't just about a man losing his temper on a chair. It's about power, about ego, about how some people will do anything to avoid rejection. And for people like Keisha, saying no, standing your ground, refusing to shrink back, refusing to give in to pressure, it can sometimes feel like an act of defiance. But it shouldn't. Because respect isn't optional. It's not up for negotiation. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay right where you are. Or step forward. If you've had an experience like this, or if you've witnessed a similar situation, I want to hear your story. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, be sure to subscribe for more. Trust me, there's always more to tell.